Grab your Bibles tonight. Open up to 2 Samuel chapter number 3, and we're going to continue through this section of a larger narrative, David's journey to the throne of Israel. We had part 1 last week, and we looked at chapter 2 of 2 Samuel. Today, we're going to look at chapter 3 of 2 Samuel. There's a lot going on. There's too much to cover in one Wednesday evening Bible study. But chapter 2 through about the 5th verse of chapter 5 really records one big story, one idea, which is getting David from where he was in the wilderness to the throne, reigning over all of Israel, as God said would come to pass, as God anointed him, which was his purpose. Now, I think a lot of what we find in this passage specifically is informational. It's part of the process. It's the details and some of the high points of how David got from being the king over Judah alone, eventually to be the king over all of Israel. With that said, there's a lot of smaller practical applications in this text. And the Bible, we know, even if it is informational, even if it is historical, as all of 1 and 2 Samuel is, there are always applications for us. 2 Timothy 3:16 says that all Scripture, it's given by inspiration of God, is profitable for doctrine and reproof and correction and instruction in righteousness, that the man of God may be what? Perfect, thoroughly furnished unto all good works. Are we dazed and confused tonight or what? My brain's in a little bit of a fog tonight too, but all Scripture is given so that we could have the application, so that we could be men and women of God that are perfect. We're complete, thoroughly furnished to all good works. And we're going to find some of that here tonight. There are lessons about bitterness and vengeance. There's lessons against being self-serving. There's a lot to learn about leadership and diplomacy from this passage, and the actions of David and the graciousness of David as he tries to unite the nation under him. There's reminders about how God can and will work all things together for good to them that love God, to those that are called according to His purpose. Dan, I feel like I'm a little loud tonight. We won't have time to get into a lot of the smaller application tonight, but the larger emphasis of the narrative, as I've said, is getting David to the throne, God getting David to the throne, and that's the main reason this is here. And I struggled with trying to find the big idea. I don't want to over-spiritualize. Like I said, there's a lot of application. There's a lot of spiritual truth here, but I don't want to over-spiritualize the major emphasis of the text. So here's the big idea. It's a simple one here tonight, and we'll apply it. We'll find some practical truth here towards the end, but here's the big idea I've settled on. What God has said will ultimately come to pass. God said that David will be king. He anointed David king. That was His purpose. He said He will reign over His people, and in this passage, Abner's even going to allude to the fact that there was a prophecy somewhere saying that David was going to deliver the people from the Philistines. And as we see the events of this chapter and how David is going to grow stronger and stronger as the house of Saul grows weaker and weaker, and really just some of the circumstances and how this is coming to pass, I think we can just kind of look and conclude and be reminded, as we already know, that what God has said will ultimately come to pass. Sometimes not in the way that we think it would, and sometimes not in the way that we think it should, but what God has said will come to pass. Will come to pass. We can take it to the bank and we can bet on it. All right, let's set some context here before we jump into 2 Samuel chapter 3. Saul has died, and he was the first king of Israel, anointed by God, but eventually rejected by God because he refused to obey God's commands. He was self-serving and he was insecure, became jealous of David, and wanted to hold on to his power, even though it wasn't his power, it was God's people, and he was to rule on behalf of God. He ruled for himself, and eventually God dealt with him. He died in battle. It was an act of God. And David and his men have at this point moved back into Israel from Ziklag, the territory of the Philistines. David settled in the city of Hebron, and his men settled in the surrounding cities. And the people of Judah came and anointed David as king, but the rest of the nation did not follow David. Hebron, David's city, became somewhat of a capital for Judah and eventually the nation of Israel before he settles in Jerusalem. Abner, the commander of Saul's army, Saul's cousin, and really at this point, he's become somewhat of the de facto leader of the other 11 tribes. And you can imagine the commander of Israel's armies in a situation like this, in a time like this. He's without the one that God has anointed. If they're not going to follow David, the commander of the army would become the leader of God's people. Because if you think back to the reason that they originally wanted a king and the reasons the elders of the different tribes covenanted together to pledge themselves under the authority of a king was because they wanted somebody to have an army and fight their battles for them. And so at this point, if that anointed king is gone and out of the picture, it's very easy, very natural that the leader of that army that would be protecting Israel still would become, in a sense, the de facto leader because there was a lack of strong leadership in Saul's house. Jonathan is dead, and two of the other brothers as well were slain in battle. There's a good chance that Abner continued to lead the army in protecting Israel, perhaps even gaining territory back that was lost to the Philistines in the defeat at Gilboa. He became allies with and worked alongside elders of the various tribes that were loyal to the house of Saul. Now it seems that about 5 years into all of this, Abner had enough influence over the tribes to set up Ishbosheth, also known as Eshbaal, in 1 Chronicles, Saul's youngest son, as king over Israel. He chooses the city of Mahanaim on the east side of Jordan to be the capital where Ishbosheth would reign from. Eventually, conflict between the armies of Abner and the army of David begins. We saw last week in chapter 2 the standoff between Abner and his men and Joab, David's commander, and his men at the pool of Gibeon. And they chose 12 young men from each side to get up and represent their side in a fight. The winners would determine the winning side, but when they 12 got up to fight, the Bible says that they all grabbed the neck of the other and struck him with the knife, and they all fell down to get dead at the same time. There was no winner. The result was a deadly battle. Joab and the rest of David's men pursued Abner and his men, killing 360 of them before giving up the chase after Abner stood upon a great hill, a mountain, and the troops of Benjamin rallied around him, and he yells out to Joab. He said, "Joab, how long is this going to continue? When are you going to stop chasing after?" And at that point, Joab said, "You know what? If you didn't say anything, we would have continued until the morning chasing you down." But they stopped during that pursuit, and this is going to come back into play here in chapter 3. During that pursuit, Joab's youngest brother, Asahel, was killed by Abner when Asahel refused to stop chasing Abner. Remember, he's chasing Abner, and he was light as a roe, a deer, a gazelle. And Abner looks back and he says, "That you, Asahel?" And he says, "Yeah, it's me." He said, "Okay, you need to stop, and you don't have any armor on you. You need to find one of these dead soldiers, and you need to arm yourself if you're going to chase me." And he said, "I'm not going to." He continued. He said, "You need to quit. How am I, if I kill you in self-defense even, how am I going to even look at your brother?" And Asahel wouldn't give it up. He continued chasing after Abner, and Abner's a seasoned warrior. He's a commander of the army. So the Bible says that Abner had a spear, and he took the blunt end, the stick end, not the point, and as Asahel approached, he rammed it into him, most likely to just kind of knock him off and give himself an advantage to get away. But even that blunt end of the spear, as fast as Asahel was approaching, went down through his chest under the fifth rib and out his back and killed Asahel right there. Most likely, it was an accident. It was definitely in self-defense of Abner, but most likely an accident. He probably intended just to kind of shock him for a second and knock him down or knock him out, but resulted in his death. Some of that, as I said, it's going to become relevant to the narrative before us tonight. That brings us here to chapter number 3. in verse 1. So let's go ahead and understand the narrative this evening. Verse 1 here provides a summary of David's ultimate success over the house of Saul during this time. We read it last week, but we'll start there as we get into it. 2 Samuel 3:1. Now, there was long war between the house of Saul and the house of David, but David waxed stronger and stronger, and the house of Saul waxed weaker and weaker. And I think it's understood by most tonight, but just in case it's not, the idea of waxing stronger and stronger is the idea of becoming stronger and stronger over time, and then becoming weaker and weaker. Verse 2, and unto David were sons born in Hebron, and the firstborn was Amnon of Ahinoam the Jezreelitess, and his second Chileab of Abigail, the wife of Nabal the Carmelite, and the third Absalom, the son of Maacah, the daughter of Talmai, king of Geshur. Now, I want to pause there. That was most likely some type of political alliance, marrying the daughter of the king of Geshur or Jeshur. Now, the Geshurites were some of those that David was committing raids against when he was in Ziklag. Perhaps he was still committing raids against them as he was in Hebron, trying to build wealth to pay his army. There's evidence later on here that he was still sending Joab and the army out on raids, and maybe the king of the Geshurites was like, dude, if you stop, I'll give you my daughter to marry. And David's like, all right, sounds good. So he had a kid. He married her and had a kid from Talmai, the daughter of the king of Geshur. And the fourth, verse 4, Adonijah, the son of Haggith, and the fifth, Shephatiah, the son of Abital, and the sixth, Ithram, by Eglah, David's wife. These were born to David in Hebron. Let's pause right there. How many wives is that? 6. Did he have any other wives? Yeah, Michal or Michal? Technically, yes, and she's going to come back here in this passage. David's got 7 wives. Is that right or wrong? 7's the number of perfection, right? Is that, if you're going to have more than one, it's got to be 7. No, obviously not. Now, Deuteronomy chapter 17, the chapter in the law that talked about when you have a king, it specifically forbid the kings of Israel from gaining multiple wives unto themselves, especially for the sake of political alliances. That was how the kings in the world at the time did it, but God said for his people, for his king of his people, it should not be the case. Now, David's not doing right here. And though it's not condemned expressly in this passage, we are working off of the revelation that God had already given back in Deuteronomy up to this point. And beside that fact, as we progress through 2 Samuel, the consequences of not obeying what God had said and taking on himself multiple wives eventually will come back to bite him. There's going to be conflict and drama in David's house with the various stepchildren and half-brothers and half-sisters, where one of the half-brothers will end up raping one of his half-sisters, and then Absalom will get upset with David, his dad, and end up taking the kingdom from him. The consequences of this will be clear and evident as we go throughout this narrative. But just to mention, this is mostly a contextual statement, beginning with how David began to get stronger and stronger, and then as we're seeing the story of David, these are his sons, and this is where his sons came from. It's not necessarily prescription or even saying that David was right and good in marrying these multiple women and having children from them while he was in Hebron. All right, let's jump into verse number 6. We'll read down through verse 11, and here the scene jumps to Ishbosheth, king in Mahanaim, and Abner. Verse number 6, and it came to pass, there was war in the house of Saul, or between the house of Saul, rather, and the house of David, that Abner made himself strong for the house of Saul. Abner was serving himself. Before even he set up Ishbosheth on the throne, he was going and taking alliances and communicating with the elders all over Israel, and he made himself strong in the sense that he got many allies around the nation. And it was the fact that Abner had made himself strong and gotten many allies that allowed him to even put up Ishbosheth on the throne that the people would even follow Ishbosheth, Saul's youngest son. Now, verse number 7, and Saul had a concubine. A concubine was one that was not the wife of the king, but was sexually and intimately involved with the king. Again, wrong. Clearly, the Bible tells us what marriage was intended to be, one wife and one woman for life, and anything outside of that, as Hebrews tells us, the marriage is honorable in all, and the bed undefiled, but whoremongers and adulterers God will judge. It was not okay for Saul to have a concubine, but nevertheless he did. It's just a description of what was and what happened. Saul had a concubine whose name was Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, and Ishbosheth said to Abner, wherefore hast thou gone in unto my father's concubine? The idea is there, Ishbosheth says, Abner, why did you go in and have relations, have physical intimacy with my father's concubine? At this time in the world, even after the death of the king, his concubines, his harem, the women that he had gathered for himself, again, not right, but it was a practice back in those days, was left to his successor. So in all reality, as Ishbosheth was Saul's successor, Saul's concubine would have become Ishbosheth's concubine, his property, so to speak. And if a man was to go and sleep or have relations with one of the king's concubines, that was an affront against the king. It was treason. It was punishable by death or whatever punishment the king saw fit. So Ishbosheth is accusing Abner of having relationships with this Rizpah, Saul's concubine, now technically Ishbosheth's concubine. Verse 8, then Abner was wroth, very wroth, for the words of Ishbosheth, and said, am I a dog's head, which against Judah do show kindness this day unto the house of Saul thy father, to his brethren and to his friends, and have not delivered thee into the hand of David, that thou chargest me today with a fault concerning this woman. Now, there's no record, there's no confirmation whether or not Abner did have relationships with Rizpah, but that was the accusation. And when Ishbosheth brought that accusation, Abner gets offended by it. He says, listen, how much have I done for you? I set you up as king. My hand has been strong for you. I've not delivered you into the hand of David. I could have delivered you into the hand of David, but I chose not to. I made you king, and this is how you repay me? By accusing me of this? Verse number 9, so do God to Abner, and more also, except as the Lord hath sworn to David, even so I do to him, to translate the kingdom from the house of Saul and set up the throne of David over Israel and over Judah from Dan even to Beersheba. And he could not answer Abner a word again because he feared him. Now this shows us the level of power and influence that Abner had. Ishbosheth at this point seems to be a puppet king. Abner is really in charge. He said, listen, because you've offended me, because you have offended my honor and dishonored me, boy, the Lord do so to me if I don't do what God promised to David and give the kingdom to him. I'm going to take all of the elders and all my influence, and I'm now shifting from allegiance to you to allegiance to David. Now, the king should have had every right and power, if his commander said that to him, to say, guard seize him, put him to death. But no, he answered Abner no word because Abner had the real power in this situation. Ishbosheth, the puppet king. Verse 12, Abner sent messengers to David on his behalf, saying, whose is the land? Saying also, make thy league with me, and behold, my hand shall be with thee, to bring about all Israel unto thee. David, if you'll make a covenant with me, I'll make a covenant with you, and I'm going to give you my allegiance, and I'll bring all of Israel with me to your side. Verse 13, and David said, well, I will make a league with thee, but one thing I require of thee, that is, thou shalt not see my face, except thou first bring Michal, Saul's daughter, when thou comest to see my face. He said, okay, sounds good. But you better bring my first wife to me. Now, David never divorced Michal. David was forced to flee from the house of Saul and from the presence of Michal. And eventually, out of spite, Saul gave Michal to another husband, another man, to marry. And David said, I want her back. Even with the 6 wives I have, it's not enough. Bring me my first wife back. In verse 14, David sent messengers to Ishbosheth, Saul's son, saying, "Deliver me my wife Michal, which I espoused to me for 100 foreskins of the Philistines." So he writes to Ishbosheth, the puppet king, and this is just like, it's crazy what's happening in Israel right now. He writes to Ishbosheth, and he says, "Listen, your sister, Michal, is my wife, and I rightly, legally bought her and paid for her because I killed 100 Philistines, which was really 200. I cut off their foreskins, and I gave them to your dad, and so Michal is mine. And I want you to send your sister that I bought for 100 foreskins of the Philistines back to me." What a way to communicate between brother-in-laws, right? Verse 15, and Ishbosheth sent, and he took her from her husband, even from Phaltiel, the son of Laish. And her husband went with her along, weeping behind her, to Bahurim. Then said Abner unto him, "Go, return." And he returned. Obviously, this is a summary of what happened, but it's kind of funny the way it's written here. You've got this guy walking behind, running behind the caravan, crying because his wife was just taken from him. And it's as if Abner just looks down from a horse. "Go home." And he stops and he returns and goes home. There's probably more to it than that, but that's the way it's reading here. And he left. So, verse number 17. Abner. And Abner had communication with the elders of Israel, saying, "Ye sought for David in time past to be king over you." Now, it's not clear if that's sometime during Saul's reign. They celebrated the fact that David slain his 10,000s, and maybe after the death of Goliath, when David was victorious. Maybe there was some point within these 5 years that the house or the various elders across Israel wanted to pledge allegiance with the house of Judah to David, but Abner got a hold of them and convinced them to be loyal to him and the house of Saul. It's not clear exactly when that was. But as Abner is going around from elder to elder across the different tribes, he says, "There was a time when you sought for David to be king over you." Verse 18, "Now then do it. For the Lord hath spoken of David, saying, By the hand of my servant David I will save my people Israel out of the hands of the Philistines and out of the hand of all their enemies." Now, there was not a specific place in 1 Samuel that we could turn to that God said that about David. God did say that about Saul, the idea that a king was sent to deliver his people from the Philistines, and perhaps he's alluding to the fact that he knew that God anointed David, so therefore David as the anointed is the one that God would deliver. It could have been another prophecy that was given that wasn't specifically recorded for us in 1 Samuel. But these people knew about it, and Abner knew about it. This proves Abner all along, like we talked about last week, he wasn't seeking the will of God, he was fighting the will of God. And right now he's not even seeking the will of God. He's seeking to get back at Ishbosheth because his honor was hurt. He said, you sought for it, God's going to deliver him. Let's do it. Verse 19, and Abner also spoke in the ears of Benjamin, and Abner went also to speak in the ears of David in Hebron, all that seemed good to Israel, and that seemed good to the whole house of Benjamin. And you'll remember that the house of Saul was of the tribe of Benjamin, and Benjamin would have been the hardest of the tribes to get on board with the house of David and the house of Judah because Saul was from them. They wanted to keep the kingship in their tribe. Verse number 20, so Abner came to David to Hebron, and 20 men with him, and David made Abner and the men that were with him a feast. And Abner said unto David, I will arise and go, and will gather all Israel unto my lord the king, that they may make a league with thee, and that thou mayest reign over all that thine heart desireth. And David sent Abner away, and he went in peace. And now at this point in the story, it seems like we're finally getting to what we've all been waiting for. David's about to be king. He's been diplomatic. He's worked with Abner, who has been an enemy, who has been for the house of Saul, but David is seeing the greater purpose, the purpose that God has, the vision of uniting Israel together and him reigning over them and being their protector and shepherd and deliverer. So he's willing to work with Abner. He's willing to be diplomatic and invite him and his men and hold that feast and draw out the terms. And Abner says, listen, the houses of Israel are ready to come, and I'm going to leave here, and you are my king. I'm pledging loyalty to you, my Lord the king. Now I'm going to leave, and I'm going to go speak to every other elder in Israel, and I'm going to bring all of Israel under your authority and leadership. So he goes out in peace. But wait, because usually that's what happens in Samuel. But wait. Verse 22, behold, the servants of David and Joab came from pursuing a troop and brought in a great spoil with them, but Abner was not with David in Hebron, for he had sent him away, and he was gone in peace. When Joab and all the host that was with him were come, they told Joab, saying, Abner the son of Ner came to the king, and he hath sent him away, and he is gone in peace. And Joab came to the king and said, what hast thou done? Behold, Abner came unto thee. Why is it that thou hast sent him away, and he is quite gone? Thou knowest Abner, the son of Ner, that he came to deceive thee, and to know thy going out and thy coming in, and to know all that thou doest. So David, what are you doing? Abner's the enemy. He's the bad guy. How could you be so foolish? How could you let him trick you? He's not coming in here to side with you. He's spying on things. You let him escape? Verse 26. When Joab was come out from David, he sent messengers after Abner, which brought him again from the well of Sirah, but David knew it not. Joab's got a plan. He said, I'm not going to let David go, or Abner go. He sent out messengers, go bring him back here. And when Abner was returned to Hebron, Joab took him aside in the gate to speak with him quietly. And he smote him there under the fifth rib, that he died for the blood of Asahel, his brother. Joab took it upon himself to take vengeance. Now this man, and the diplomacy that David had worked for, is teetering on the edge. The one that had the respect of all the other tribes of Israel, the de facto leader in Israel at this time, the commander of the army, who was convincing them to come under David's leadership, now was killed in the secrecy of night, murdered and laid to waste in the city of David the king by one of David's men, his commander of his army. You understand that now, like this unification that was already hanging by a thread is now threatened because of Joab's vindictive, self-serving actions. Verse 28. Afterward, when David heard it, he said, I and my kingdom are guiltless before the Lord forever from the blood of Abner the son of Ner. Let it rest on the head of Joab and on all his father's house, and let there not fail from the house of Joab one that hath an issue, or that has a leper, or that is a leper, or that leaneth on a staff, or that falleth on the sword, or that lacketh bread. So Joab and Abishai his brother slew Abner, because he had slain their brother Asahel at Gibeon in the battle. And the Bible makes it very clear for us that this was not Joab having some type of military strategy to take down the commander of the other side. No, this was personal. He and Abishai was in it in some way, shape, or form. We don't know how, but they plotted to kill Abner because they wanted vengeance for their brother Asahel. Now, Hebron was one of the areas. There was a city in Hebron. It could have been this one. It could have been a different area that was supposed to be a city of refuge. There was no reason for Joab to avenge his brother against Abner, who was running away from the pursuit of Asahel, and he turned around in self-defense, trying not to kill him, and ended up killing him. No reason whatsoever that Joab had the right to do that. It was nothing but bitterness and vengeance. David made it clear that he had nothing to do with it. And to make sure that the rest of the nation understood that David had nothing to do with this, he pronounces a curse on the house of Joab. He said, him, his children, Let it not lack from his house. One that has an issue, the idea of some type of sickness, or one that's a leper, or one that leans on his staff, one that has a limp, or is lame in some way, shape, or form, or one that lacks bread, one that has famine and hunger. Being serious, pouring out the reality that I cannot believe that Joab did this. Eventually, in 1 Kings chapter 2, on David's deathbed, he will tell his son Solomon, you need to deal with Joab because he killed 2 people in a time of peace. And don't let him die a quiet death. And it will come back years later, decades later, 30-something years later, to haunt Joab what he did here. Keep that in mind. Verse 31, David said to Joab and to all the people that were with him, rend your clothes and gird you with sackcloth and mourn before Abner. And King David himself followed the bear. He looks at Joab and the men. He said, you better mourn. Don't be celebrating this. Don't be celebrating the fact that you got vengeance on your brother. You better tear your clothes. You better put yourself sackcloth and ashes on. You better look and appear to the rest of Israel that you are mourning for the death of the great commander of the armies of Israel, who for decades had worked to keep Israel safe in war against the Philistines. David followed the bear. Would have been a wooden platform or a platform of some kind that the casket would have been laid on and would have been carried on this bear on the way to the funeral to lay Abner to rest. Verse 32, they buried Abner in Hebron. David gave him a royal funeral, and at that time, the royal city. And the king lifted up his voice, and he wept at the grave of Abner, and all the people wept. And the king lamented over Abner and said, died Abner as a fool dieth? Thy hands were not bound, nor thy feet put upon into fetters. As a man falleth before wicked men, so fellest thou. And all the people wept again over him. David had a great outpouring of grief and lamentation and wailing for Abner, and the people took notice of it. Uncommon for a king to have, but David nonetheless poured out his emotion in honor to Abner. He says, you died as a fool. You didn't die as you should have died. In the honor of battle, you died like a common fool in the streets, laid before the darkness. Verse 35, when all the people came to cause David to eat meat, while it was yet day, David swore, saying, do God to me, and more also, if I taste bread or aught else till the sun be down. He said, I'm not going to eat, I'm mourning. I will not eat while the sun is still up today as I mourn for Abner. Verse 36, all the people took notice of it, and it pleased them, as whatsoever the king did pleased all the people. For all the people and all Israel understood that day that it was not of the king to slay Abner the son of Ner. And the king said unto his servants, know ye not that there is a prince and a great man fallen this day in Israel? And I am this day weak, though anointed king. And these men, the sons of Zeruiah, be too hard for me. The Lord shall reward the doer of evil according to his wickedness. That idea, the fact that David said he was weak and these men are too strong for him. He said, I'm king, and it's up to me to be the one to mete out punishment and justice in this nation, but I'm gentle and meek in my leadership at this point. These 2 boys, my nephews, the sons of my sister Zeruiah, Joab and Abishai, they're too strong, they're too rough, they're too harsh for me. And God is going to deal with those that do wickedly, according to their wickedness. That's how he ends it there. That's the narrative. Let's jump back up to the big picture. The big idea is this: what God has said will ultimately come to pass. And the house of David is growing stronger and prospering as the house of Saul is growing weaker. The man central to hindering David from reigning over the entire nation, Abner, in this narrative ends up defecting to David's side and convinces others to pledge loyalty to David. Nobody would have saw it coming. Abner, the one that was most loyal to Saul and now most loyal to his house and had reign over the entire nation, now is defecting to the other side, defecting to David. And then all of a sudden that man is murdered. And you'd think that the unification of the kingdom is hanging by a thread, but it doesn't prevent the work of uniting the people under David. Eventually, and it will come to pass next week, we'll see it, God uses this tragedy to even bring greater respect for David. And it may not be in our timing, and it may not be in the way that we think it will or should happen, but we ought to remember that what God has said will ultimately come to pass. That's everything in His Word. Everything that we're waiting for when it comes to the end times and Revelation, ultimately it will come to pass. Amen? And it may not be in our thinking, and obviously God has laid it out in Revelation and other passages. There's some things that are abundantly clear, but there's some things that are ambiguous, and we can theorize about it, and it may not come with our theories, but what God has said and written down and prophesied, it will come to pass, and we can trust in that. What's the big picture, the big idea in the narrative of Samuel? The narrator here continues to establish David as not only God's chosen leader for His people, but also a good leader, the optimal choice for leader of His people. David's diplomatic while serving God's purpose and letting the interest of His people, or putting the interest of His people, rather, before His own. How can we consider Jesus in this passage? There's a lot of self-serving acts of both leadership and people in general in this passage. Joab was very self-serving. He couldn't care less about unifying the nation and the work that Abner was doing and the diplomacy to bring about God's past purpose and bringing God's people together. He went on a personal vendetta that served his own interest. Even Abner. Abner, yes, God was using that situation and using Abner to bring the people, but Abner wasn't doing it out of respect for God. Abner was serving himself. He got offended. And because he got offended, he's going to take the rest of the nation over to David's side. It's crazy as you consider it. A lot of self-serving in this passage, but Jesus is the opposite. Even the Son of Man, Mark 10:45 says, came not to be ministered unto, but to minister and give His life a ransom for many. That's what we are to model. Not the self-service that these men modeled, but the others' service of Jesus. Let's see a few takeaways tonight, 4 of them this evening, then we'll be done. Number 1, recognize that bitterness often clouds our judgment, and we should be on guard against it. When we allow bitterness towards others to set in our hearts, it will cloud our judgment of situations, of other people, and of the world. We've got to guard against that. Joab's judgment in this whole situation was clouded because he was bitter against Abner for what he did to his brother. In Joab's mind, he could see right through Abner's deception. David, you're letting him take advantage of you. I know Abner. He's a horrible guy, and he's not on our side, and he's not there to transfer power to you, David. He's spying. He came to gather information on us. He's not here to help. He's the enemy. Now, Abner's motives, as we said, they were not entirely pure. They were out of self-interest and self-preservation, motivated by anger toward Ishbosheth for dishonoring him. But though his motives were not pure, his intentions were good, to bring the nation under David as God desired. Abner was doing a good thing by working to unite the kingdom under God's anointed one, but Joab's bitterness blinded him from seeing that. Now, we can be like that sometimes, especially those who tend to be more discerning about things. But sometimes our discernment is not discernment at all. It's simply our bitterness springing up in our hearts and showing through in our actions and the way that we see people. We've got to be on guard against that. We can't let that direct our steps as it did Joab. We've got to go to God in prayer, let Him sort those things out. Lord, search me, see if there be any wicked way in me. Lord, show me and nudge me by your Spirit if I'm thinking wrong about this person because of the way that they treated me in the past. We've got to be careful about that. We've got to be on guard about that. Number 2, it's another takeaway. We've got to stay faithful to God's purpose, even as others serve their own interests. That's what David was trying to do. He just wanted to bring about what God desired, the nation being united under His kingship and under His shepherding. And there's going to be some that try to go about God's purposes based on their own self-interests, and yeah, we'll let them help, but ultimately we're serving God and what He wants. There's going to be some like Joab that are going to defect, and they're going to serve themselves and do whatever they want based on their own emotion. And when we see different people serving different purposes out of their own self-interest, we move forward in faithfulness to God and His purposes. That's the example that we see in David here tonight. Number 3, understand this. God can use all things, even great tragedy, to accomplish His purposes. It would seem that Abner, being the central one to unite the kingdom, and we've talked about it, hanging on a thread now that he's gone. But that wasn't the case. God used even that tragedy and the way that David responded to that tragedy, the way that David responded to Abner's death in wisdom and care and in graciousness, and the entirety of the nation was looking on, and the way that he handled that, they were pleased by it. They gained more respect for David seeing the way that he handled it, and everything that David did in that matter, it pleased the people. And God used even that tragedy and David's handling of it to increase the respect of the people to him, and eventually they'd come and anoint him king in Hebron. Lastly tonight, remember, as David said here in the close of the chapter, that God will deal with those who do wickedly. Recognize that. There are consequences to actions, and Joab's consequences will come later on in his life. But if we decide to take matters in our own hand, not wait on God, to avenge ourselves and do that which is wicked, what God has said not to do, then God will deal with us accordingly. We will pay the consequences, and we ought to be reminded of that this evening.